In the fall of 1994, a soil scientist named Carl Hode stood at the edge of a 40-acre field in Bleckley County, Georgia, crouched, pushed 2 fingers into the pale ground, let it run out, and told the woman beside him that her father had been right about one thing in his life, and it was that this dirt would never amount to anything. He said it kindly. That was the part Della Brandt would remember longest, that he had smiled when he said it, that he had wanted to help. The soil he let fall was the color of weak coffee with too much cream, almost white where the sun hit it, and it drained so fast that a hard rain was gone from the top 6 inches inside an hour. To a man trained to read a county by its yield maps, it was a worthless field on a worthless farm, and he had the test sheets to prove it. 18 years later, a chef in Atlanta would pay more for a single case of the oil, pressed from what grew in that field, than Roy Tisdale, the best irrigated corn man in the county, cleared on an acre of his bottomland in a good year. Let me tell you about the 18 years in between, because the distance between those 2 prices, the whole story. And it is a story about 2 ways of looking at the same handful of sand. Stay with this one. You may have stood in a field someone told you was worthless. Della was 41 that fall, and she had come back to Bleckley County, the way a lot of people come back, which is to say she had not planned to. She had a degree in food science from down in Athens and 11 years at a bottling plant in Macon. And she had a father, Walt, who had just died in the front room of the house he was born in, leaving her 160 acres of land that the bank valued at almost nothing and the neighbors valued at less. Walt Brandt had farmed that sand his whole life and had never once made it pay. He grew a little of everything and a lot of nothing, and the running joke in the county, told without much cruelty, was that the Brandt place grew the finest crop of disappointment in Middle Georgia. Walt had believed it himself by the end. He used to stand on the porch in the evening and look out at the pale fields and say the soil was worthless, that a smarter man would have walked away from it in 1970 and never looked back. He said it so often that Della had grown up believing it was simply a fact about the world, like the heat in August, or the red clay one county, over that her father envied his whole life. Della was not by temperament a farmer. She was known in the family for 2 things. She was patient to the point of stubbornness, and she could taste the difference between 2 oils, the way some people can hear, the difference between 2 notes. At the plant in Macon, she had run quality control on cooking oils, and she had a palate that the chemists trusted more than their instruments. When a batch of canola came in tasting faintly of cardboard, she could say so before the gas chromatograph confirmed it. That was the skill she carried home to Bleckley County, and at first it seemed about as useful there as a degree in marine biology, because nobody in Bleckley County was pressing oil. They were growing commodity peanuts under contract to a sheller 2 counties away, and they were growing irrigated corn. And the ones who were prospering were the ones with the biggest center pivot systems and the most debt. Carl Hode came out that first fall because Della had asked him to. She was trying to decide whether to sell the place or work it, and she wanted to know what the land could do. Hode was the regional agronomist, 50-some years old, with a master's degree from a good school and 25 years of soil reports behind him. He was not a bad man. He was, if anything, a generous one, the kind who would stay an extra hour to walk a widow's field for free because he genuinely believed that good information was a form of mercy. He simply believed that the only information worth having came off a test sheet, and the test sheet on the Brandt place was grim. Organic matter under 1%. Sand content above 80. Water holding capacity so low that the standard recommendation was irrigation or abandonment. He stood in the field and showed her the numbers on his clipboard. The way a doctor turns a chart so the patient can see it too. It will not hold water and it will not hold nutrients, he told her. You can farm it the way your daddy did and lose a little every year. Or you can put in a pivot and a well and chase the corn money. But that is $100,000 you do not have. And on this dirt, I am not sure it pencils. He walked her down the field as he talked, stopping every so often to push the probe into the ground and read the core, and at each stop the story was the same: pale sand to the depth of his arm and no sign of the dark crumb that means a living soil. He paused at the low corner, and he gave her the kindly smile she would remember. To be honest with you, he said, this is a hobby farm waiting to happen. There is no shame in selling. So that was the word he set down on her land that afternoon, gently the way you would set down a sleeping child. A hobby. He had not meant it to land hard. He had 3 more farms to walk that day, and a daughter in college, and a sincere belief that the kindest thing he could do for a widow's child was to tell her the truth as his instruments understood it, and let her go free of a losing place. He shook her hand, and he told her to call him if she had questions. And he meant that, too. Then he drove off in a clean white state pickup that had never once been stuck in that sand, the tires throwing a little pale dust on the lane. And Della stood in the field her father had cursed and held a handful of the soil and watched it run pale through her fingers and did the thing she had always done at the plant when an instrument told her one thing and her own senses told her another. She did not argue with the instrument. She did not trust it either. She paid attention. Let me tell you about peanuts, because you cannot understand what Della saw that fall unless you understand the plant. And almost nobody who eats them does. A peanut is not a nut. It is a legum, a cousin to beans and clover, and like its cousins, it carries on its roots small nodules full of bacteria that pull nitrogen out of the air and fix it into the soil. That is the first thing. A peanut feeds itself and leaves the ground richer than it found it, which is the opposite of corn, which eats nitrogen by the truckload and gives nothing back. The second thing is stranger, and it is the thing that mattered most on the Brandt place. A peanut does not grow its pod in the air like a bean. It flowers above ground, and then, after the flower is fertilized, it sends down a stalk called a peg that drives the developing pod into the earth, and the peanut matures underground in the dark, in the top few inches of soil. And here is the part Hode's test sheet could not see. A peanut peg cannot push through heavy ground. In the tight red clay 1 county over, the clay Walt Brandt had envied his whole life. The pegs struggled and snapped, and the pods came up small and rotted. But in loose, pale, fast-draining sand, the peg slid down like a knife into water, and the pod grew clean and dry and free of the rots that plague peanuts in wetter ground. The very thing that made the soil worthless for corn made it close to perfect for a peanut. Walt had grown peanuts every year of his life, and had never once understood why his were always cleaner than his neighbors on the heavier ground. He thought he was unlucky in everything else, and simply lucky in that. He never knew it was the sand. Della knew, because she had read it, and then she had gone out into the cold November field, and dug on her knees with a hand trowel, and counted the clean pods on her father's last volunteer plants, and confirmed it with her own hands, the way she had confirmed 1,000 suspect, oils against 1,000 confident instruments. And that winter, in the cold front room where her father had died, she found the other half of the answer. It was a ledger, not a farm ledger of the ordinary kind, but a spiral notebook, the wire gone to rust and the cardboard cover soft with handling, in which Walt Brandt had recorded, in a cramped hand that slanted hard to the right, 40 years of something he had never told a living soul he was doing. He had been pressing oil, not to sell. He had built a little screw press out of truck jack and a length of pipe sometime in the 1960s. And every fall, after the contract crop was sold off for almost nothing, he had pressed a few gallons of oil from a corner of his own peanuts. And he had written down, year after year, which varieties pressed best, which tasted of grass and which of butter, how cold he kept the nuts in the cellar before pressing, and how slow he ran the screw, so the oil would not heat. There were temperatures in the margins. There were tasting notes. A sommelier would have recognized, written by a man who never in his life drank wine, the man the county pitied for growing the finest crop of disappointment in Middle Georgia, had been quietly conducting the longest peanut oil experiment Della had ever heard of, and writing the results in a child's spiral notebook, and telling no one, because who would he tell? The soil was worthless. He had said so himself on the porch 1,000 evenings. He had believed the verdict the county handed him, and he had gone on doing the patient work anyway, in private the way some men pray. Let me tell you what cold pressing does, because this is the second mechanism, and it is the one that built the price. Most peanut oil, the kind in the jug at the store, is pressed hot and then washed with solvent and deodorized with steam until it is clear and bland and good for nothing but frying, which is all anyone asks of it. The heat and the solvent strip out the flavor and most of what is delicate in the oil. Walt's press worked cold, slow, and dirty by industrial standards, and it left almost everything in. The oil that came off it was the color of dark amber, and it tasted, when Della first put a drop on her tongue from a jar she found in the cellar, of roasted peanut and something green and almost grassy underneath, and a sweetness on the back of the throat that she had never once tasted in 11 years of testing commodity oil. She sat on the cellar floor with the jar in her hand and understood, with the part of her that had never been wrong about an oil, that her father had made something rare and had died believing it was nothing. Her nephew Sam came down that first spring. He was 24, a year out of an agribusiness program, and he had opinions and the good clothes to deliver them in. He had come, ostensibly, to help his aunt clean out the place and talk sense into her about selling, and he arrived with a leather folder full of spreadsheets and the calm certainty of a young man who has been taught the whole world fits inside a model and has never yet met the part of it that does not. Sam liked Hode. He had looked the agronomist up before he drove down and was impressed by the man's credentials, and the two of them spoke the same language. When Hode stopped by that spring, the language of yield per acre and break even, and amortization and highest and best use, and Della watched her nephew and the expert nod at each other across her kitchen, and felt for a moment like the only person in the room who could not read the document everyone else was holding. Within a week, Sam had built her a financial projection, a clean thing with colored cells that showed the peanut oil idea losing money every year for 6 years running. The numbers do not work, Aunt Della, he told her at the kitchen table, turning the laptop so she could see, with the rust-stiffened spiral ledger he did not respect, sitting closed between them. You cannot compete with the Schellers on volume, and you cannot compete with the imports on price. The Argentine oil lands in Savannah at $1.10 a liter. You will be all in at $4 or $5 to make a liter of yours. Who pays 4 times the going rate for cooking oil? He closed the laptop gently, the way a man closes a casket. He was not wrong about a single one of his numbers. He was wrong about what the numbers were measuring, which is a different and much harder thing to be wrong about. And it would take him years and a drought to see it, and that is getting ahead of the story. What did you have to lose by trying? You might be wondering. And that was close to Della's own reasoning. She had no debt and a paid-off farm, and a skill nobody around her could use, so she planted. Not the contract variety the sheller wanted, but an old runner type. Her father's ledger rated highest for oil, a variety the sheller would not even take because it did not size out for the candy. Market seed she tracked down from a foundation grower over near Plains in 2-pound lots, like a person buying something illegal, paying in cash and driving home with the sacks on the seat beside her. She planted 10 acres the first year, by hand at the ends and with an old 2-row planter. Her father had kept running with baling wire down the middle in the loose, pale sand that the planter slid through without a fight, and she did the thing her father had done, and Hody could not measure. She paid attention to one piece of ground. She learned which low corner held a little more moisture, and planted it first when the spring ran dry. She learned that the sand warmed early, weeks ahead of the clay 1 county over, so she could get her seed in the ground while the corn men were still waiting on their bottomland to dry. And an early peanut is a peanut that finishes before the worst of the August heat. She learned to walk the rows in the dead of July, when the corn across the road stood tall and green and arrogant under its turning pivots, and her peanuts looked low and yellowing and unimpressive at the surface, and to push her hand into the warm sand under a plant and feel the pegs already driven down and the pods already forming, fat and clean, underground where no test sheet and no satellite and no agronomist's probe ever reached. The field looked like failure from the road. That was the whole secret of it, and it was a secret only, because looking from the road was the only way most people had ever learned to look. Across the road was Roy Tisdale. And let me tell you about Roy, because his ledger ran beside Della's for 18 years, and you cannot feel the end of this story without him. Roy was a good farmer, maybe the best in the county, and a kind neighbor who plowed Della's drive every winter with the loader on his big tractor and never once let her pay him for it. He farmed 2,000 acres of irrigated corn and commodity peanuts, and he farmed it the way the experts said to, which is to say big, uniform, efficient, and financed to the hilt. In 2008, he put in a new 8-tower center pivot that cost more than Della's whole farm was worth, and a deeper well to feed it, and a grain dryer to bring the corn in fast. And he borrowed against the bottomland to do all of it. And for a few years, he looked like the smartest man in 3 counties. His corn averaged 200 bushels to the acre. His equipment was new, and his shop was climate-controlled, and his boots, when he came across the road to sit on Della's porch of an evening, were clean and would stay clean. Because a man with that much pivot does not walk his fields anymore. He watches them on a screen on his kitchen wall, soil moisture sensors reporting in colored bars. He was proud of that screen. He showed it to Della once, and she looked at the neat colored bars and thought of her father pushing 2 fingers into the dirt and could not have told you then which of them knew more. To the bank, Roy Tisdale was a model client, the kind they put in the brochure. To Della, he was something gentler and sadder than that. A kind man building a beautiful, heavy, rigid machine on 3 assumptions he had never thought to question. That the rain would come, that the water would be there to pump when it did not, and that the price of corn would always cover the note. Not one of those assumptions was foolish. They had all been true his whole life. They were just narrow, and they had never once been tested by the kind of year that comes around twice in a century, and a man cannot see the edge of a thing that has never failed in front of him. Hode came back the 2nd year, and the 3rd, always kind, always carrying the test sheet that had not changed. The organic matter ticked up 1/10 of a point, then another, as the peanuts did their slow work of feeding the ground. But it was still poor dirt by any measure he was trained to use. At a county field day in front of 40 growers, he used the Brant place as a teaching example, gently, of what he called a boutique operation, a hobby that could not scale, a sentimental attachment to land that a rational person would convert to its highest use or sell. He did not mean it as a wound. He meant it as a kindness, a warning to the young growers not to romanticize bad ground. Della was in the back row, and she did not raise her hand, and she did not argue. She went home and pressed oil. That was the year she sold her first 300 bottles, mostly to people in Macon, who remembered her from the plant, and the year she learned that the people who tasted it did not ask the price first. By 2010, she had a real press, a proper expeller bought used from a closed mill in Alabama, and she had Sam helping her run it, though Sam still kept his spreadsheet and still believed, mostly, that he was indulging a beloved aunt. Sam had a flicker that year, the first one. A buyer for a small grocery chain in Atlanta tasted the oil at a farmer's market and ordered a standing case every week. And the buyer did not negotiate the price, and Sam, watching, frowned in a way Della recognized. It was the frown of a young man whose model had just produced a result it could not explain. He wrote the order in his folder, and he did not say anything. But that night at the kitchen table, he picked up Walt's old spiral ledger, the one he had dismissed, and he read it for an hour without speaking, turning the rust-stiffened pages, and he asked his aunt one quiet question about which variety pressed sweetest, and Della knew the conversion had begun. It would take the drought to finish it. Let me tell you about water, and about how a thing built to be efficient can be built, without anyone intending it to be fragile. Roy Tisdale's whole operation depended on the Floridan Aquifer, the great underground sea of water that lies beneath South Georgia and feeds the wells that feed the pivots. For decades, the rule had been simple. You drilled, you pumped. The rain recharged the aquifer over winter, and the cycle held. But every pivot in the county pulled from the same water, and the years had been getting drier, and the permits had been getting tighter, and Roy, like every good farmer following good advice, had built his entire enterprise on the assumption that when his corn needed water in July, the water would be there to pump. Della's peanuts needed no pump. They sent their roots down into the deep sand after what moisture there was, and the same fast-draining soil that could not hold a hard rain also could not waterlog a root, and the runner peanut, bred and selected over a century for exactly this kind of dryland ground, simply endured. To Roy, July of a dry year meant running the pivots around the clock and watching the power bill climb. To Della, it meant waiting and trusting the plant and trusting the stand. Two kinds of knowledge standing in two fields across a county road, and for years it was impossible to say which was right, because the rain kept coming, just enough. Then came 2012. It is a year they still talk about in that part of Georgia. The year the rain did not come. The drought built slowly. Through the spring, a deficit that the long-range forecasts kept promising would break, and that never did, week after week of high blue sky. That would have been beautiful if it had not been killing everything underneath it. By June, the pastures had gone the color of straw. By July, the whole southeast was in the grip of it, the worst single-year drought the region had logged since the records began. The corn went first, because corn is a thirsty crop with shallow demands and no patience in it. Across the county, the dryland corn burned standing in the field, the leaves rolling tight as cigars by mid-morning, the ears coming up half-filled and chalky, and the irrigated corn drank the aquifer as fast as the pumps could pull it. The pivots turning day and night, and the price of the power to run them doubled, and then climbed past that. And then the state, watching the monitored wells drop faster than anyone had seen. did the thing that had never happened in living memory. It restricted pumping. Roy Tisdale got a letter on state letterhead that told him he could not run his pivots at full draw during the daylight hours. At the exact stretch of July, when his corn was tasseling and needed water, more than it would need it all season, and there was nothing in his beautiful financed, efficient operation that could bend to absorb the blow. He had bet everything on a single system, and the system had a single point of failure, and the failure had arrived with a postmark. His corn made 80 bushels to the acre, where it should have made 200. He had signed a note built for 200. He sat at his own climate-controlled kitchen table that August with the letter and the loan papers side by side, and could not make the two of them agree, and his wife heard him say once, quietly, that he did not. He did not finish the sentence. The narrator will not finish it for him. Let me tell you what happened next, because this is where the two ledgers that had run side by side for 18 years finally crossed. Sam was the one who took the count that fall in the Brant peanut field, with a hand digger and a tarp and a hanging scale, the old way, on his knees in the sand, because there was no satellite and no sensor that could see what was happening underground. And the only way to know was to dig it up and weigh it. And Roy Tisdale walked across the road to watch, in clean boots that got sandy at last, 'cause by then everyone in the county had heard that the worthless ground had come through the drought standing. And a man whose own fields had burned to chalk wanted to understand how, even if understanding came late. A dozen neighbors gathered along the wire fence. Hode was not there. Sam dug the measured plots and shook the dirt from the plants, and pulled the pods and counted them, and weighed them on the hanging scale, and ran the arithmetic in his head, and then again on paper, because he did not believe it the first time, and his clean young hands were not clean anymore. Then he stood up in the field with the sand on his hands and the figure in his throat, and read it aloud to the people at the fence: 4,200 pounds an acre. In the worst drought year in a century, on the soil Carl Hode had measured and called worthless, on the dirt Walt Brant had cursed from his own porch. For 40 years, Della Brant's dryland peanuts had out-yielded the county's average in an ordinary wet year, while 400 yards away, the irrigated corn that was supposed to be the smart money, the financed money, the money the bank put in its brochure, lay dead and chalk-eared in the next field, over at 80 bushels, against a note built for 200. Nobody said anything. The number sat in the dry air over that field, with a weight that surprised every person standing at the fence, more weight than a yield figure has any right to carry, because it was not really a yield at all. It was a verdict. It was an arithmetic answer to a question the whole county had been asking for 18 years without ever quite knowing. It was asking it. The question of which kind of knowing was real. 4,200 pounds. Roy Tisdale took off his cap and turned it in his hands and looked at the ground, and then he looked back across the road at his own dead corn, and he did not say one word. There was nothing in his model that could speak to what he was looking at. The fence stayed quiet along. Why, in the slanting afternoon light, the way a room goes quiet, after something true has been said that cannot be taken back. And then, one by one, the neighbors went home to think about their own sandy corners. Carl Hode came out that winter, on his own, this time. Not for a test and not for a field day, just a man in a clean truck, driving slow up a sandy lane. He found Della at the press. He stood in the doorway a while, watching the dark amber oil run. And when he finally spoke, he did not reach for his clipboard, which he had not brought. "I have been reading soil in this county for 26 years, he said, and I read yours wrong." He said it plainly, the way an honest man states a fact he does not enjoy. "I measured what I knew how to measure. I did not know how to measure what your daddy knew." Then he asked her, a senior agronomist with a master's degree, asked a woman whose father he had pitied if she would walk him through how the runner pegged in the sand, because he wanted to understand it. And he had a notebook in his coat pocket, and he opened it. The expert had become a student. There was no cruelty in it, on either side. There was just a man who had finally seen the edge of his own map. The buyer who finished the story was a chef named Pruitt, who ran a restaurant in Atlanta that the food magazines fought over, and who had been served Della's oil without being told what it was by a cook who knew her from the Macon market. Pruitt drove down himself, 2 hours each way, which chefs of his standing do not do, and he came into the press house in good shoes that he did not seem to care about getting sandy, and he tasted the oil the way Della tasted oil. A single drop on the back of the hand, then on the tongue. Eyes closed, a long silence, longer than was comfortable, while Sam stood by the press not breathing, and Birch watched from the doorway. He did not ask the price. He asked one question, which was whether she could promise him the same oil every single year, the same color and the same green note under the roast, because he could build a dish around an ingredient, only if the ingredient did not betray him. And when she said she could, because the sand did not change, and the variety did not change, and the method was written down in a spiral notebook in her father's hand. He nodded once, and he placed a standing order. And then he did a thing that buyers do not do. He named the price himself rather than let her name it, named it higher than she would have dared ask, because a man who has tasted enough oil to run that kitchen knew exactly what he was holding, and would not insult it by haggling. The figure he named per case was the figure I promised you at the start. It was more for a single case of oil from the worthless field than Roy Tisdale cleared on an acre of his best irrigated bottomland in a good year. Walt Brandt had pressed that same oil for 40 years and died believing it was nothing. His daughter had not invented anything he had not made. She had simply finally found the one man in the world qualified to taste it and say so out loud. Della did not get rich, and she would not have used the word if you offered it to her. She did something harder and rarer. She kept the operation the size the land could carry. When a venture group out of Atlanta offered to fund an expansion, 50,000 bottles a year, contract acreage, across 3 counties, she turned them down because she knew, the way her father had known things without being able to prove them, that the oil was good, precisely because it came from one piece of ground, tended by one person who paid attention, and that the moment you scaled it to 50,000 bottles, you would be selling the Argentine oil with a prettier label. She held it 12,000 bottles. She paid a fair price for peanuts to 4 neighbors who agreed to grow the runner her way. On their own sandy corners, they had always considered worthless, and she taught them the method out of the spiral notebook. And she pressed it all on the one press, slow and cold and dirty by industrial standards. Roy Tisdale was one of those 4. He did not lose his farm, though it was close, and the year after the drought he came across the road and asked Della, plainly the way Hode had, to teach him the dry land way on the 80 sandy acres he had always farmed carelessly because the real money was supposed to be in the corn. He still ran corn on his bottomland, but he put the sand into runner peanuts, grown Della's way, and it carried him through the next dry year, and the kind man who had built the beautiful rigid machine learned, late but not too late, to keep one part of his operation that could bend. Sam stayed. He never went back to the spreadsheets, or rather he kept them, but he no longer believed they were the territory. He took over the press, and he kept the spiral ledger in a drawer beside it, and he added his own entries in his own hand below his grandfather's. 40 years of one and now the start of another, the chain unbroken. He named his first daughter after nobody in particular, but he taught her, when she was old enough to walk the field, to push 2 fingers into the sand and feel how loose and warm it was, and to understand that this was not a flaw. Let me tell you the one thing this story has been about all along. Now that you have seen it pay off, there are 2 kinds of knowledge in the world, and they are not equal, though our age treats only one of them as real. There is the wide, shallow, confident kind that measures what is easy to measure and builds models out of it and mistakes the model for the world. And there is the narrow, deep, patient kind that comes from 40 years of attention to one handful of dirt and cannot be written on a test sheet at all. The first kind is faster and louder, and it usually wins, right up until the year it does not. The year the rain fails, or the rate spikes, or the assumption that nobody questioned turns out to have been holding up the whole house. Then the patient knowledge, the kind everyone called a hobby and a sentiment, and a worthless attachment to bad ground, turns out to have been the only thing standing. What a system measures and what is truly valuable are 2 different things. And a sandy field is the proof, and so is a spiral notebook, and so is a dog named Birch. I have not told you about Birch, and I should, because she was there the whole time. She was the brown farm dog who had been Walt's, and then was Della's, who lay in the press house doorway through 18 years of pressing and rode in the truck the day. Hody first called the field worthless and slept. In the sun the day Sam read out the number that changed everything. She was old by the end, gray on the muzzle, and on the last evening of this story, she lay at Delta's boot on the porch, where Walt used to stand and call the soil worthless, in the long amber light of a Georgia fall, while across the road the corn came back green under the pivots, and beside the road the peanuts grew low, and patient and clean in the pale and perfect sand. Della Brandt did not say the soil was worthless. She knew better. The dirt had never been the poor thing. The poverty had been in the way it was measured.